You're listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Well, welcome to Boomers Today. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. And of course, each week we bring you important and very useful information on issues facing baby boomers, their parents, and other loved ones. And I can't thank all of you enough, as I do each and every week, for tuning in and sharing our podcasts and individual shows with friends and family members. And many of you listen to the podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Stitcher. We're pretty much on every one of those podcast stations. Some of you go to our website at boomerstodayradio.com. And so I thank you. And I know why you listen to these podcasts and why you're sharing it, because we have great guests. And we're not going to disappoint you today. We have with us Ryan Frederick, who focuses on the intersection of place and health longevity. He is the author of Right Place, Right Time, The Ultimate Guide to Choosing a Home for the Second Half of Life. He advises real estate, health organizations, and institutional investment firms on how to create better places to help people thrive, and provides regular content for consumers to make wise choices about places to live a long, healthy, and financially secure life. So Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Today. I really appreciate it.
Excited to be here, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great stuff. And we're gonna talk about your book, which I want to learn more about as well. But maybe, and these are about a half-hour show, and this one question could probably, I bet you could spend a half hour on, but let's try to keep it a little shorter. But if you could give us kind of a overview on a little bit about maybe the past, the present, and where you see things headed as it relates to senior housing, and I guess senior care falls into that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Frank. And it's an interesting, I come from this from an interesting perspective, Frank, because I've spent about 15 or so years in the senior housing field as an investor, operator, developer, on the boards of companies. I advise groups across the country today on strategy. So I have a firsthand view. I've also lived in a senior living community when I was in my late 20s. So that was an enlightening experience. And my book is an outcome of sharing a lot of those insights for consumers. So I look at this from the industry perspective, but I also look at this from a consumer's perspective. And I think your question is relevant to both past, present, future. So I think what's happened, Frank, is that, I could easily take half an hour on this. But the truncated version is we've had this evolution of senior housing and care, which really, I would say, started in earnest for the greatest generation, the World War II generation. And that psyche and the way the industry approached it was, we will provide services and care, provide a peace of mind for people. But it was really largely one experience. There wasn't a whole lot of customization to it. It was largely, I would say, that the audience was largely Caucasian, married couples, people of faith generally. And that's the lineage it's come from. You kind of fast forward to today, and when we look at the leading boomers kind of in their mid 70s, and the silent generation, who are largely those that are in senior living today, it starts to become a bit more of a more diverse population, many more single people of different religions, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people living a lot longer now, Frank. You've got, of course, concerns around dementia and ways in which through lifestyle we can influence some of the probabilities of dementia. Of course, seems to be some announcements just this week around some advances, perhaps on the pharmaceutical side. But it's become much more institutionalized at this point, Frank. You've got large investors here in the U.S., internationally, building professionally managed communities. Some have a continuum of care. Some focus on dementia only. Some have more lifestyle focused on independent living. One of the more emerging product types is age-restricted Class A apartments, where you're seeing those built in larger suburban areas today. There's a lot of number of investors behind that. So you're seeing many more options, I would say, Frank, than you saw in the past. More are now owned by institutional investors. I talk about in the book what that means, because in some cases, some of these investors have short-term horizons. And that means you see properties change hands, and that can change the experience for those that live there. Their home feels different when some of these transactions happen. Management companies, change is part of it too. When we look toward the future, I think you're going to see a lot more options. And I think you're going to see more options that aren't necessarily age restricted, more places where maybe your building is age restricted, but it's in a location in which there's just more people of different generations. I think you're going to see one of the massive changes. I go into this in the book in a couple of chapters. You're seeing this shift that was happening before the pandemic, but it accelerated. And that is the ability to have home care and other health services brought to you, no matter the environment. So one of the again, not to go into too much detail, but one of the product types that's available in senior housing is that continuum of care, whether it's a continuing care retirement community or a life plan community. This idea that you start off in independent living, and then as your needs change and perhaps progress, you've got assisted living and skilled nursing, perhaps dementia care available to you. Well, because of these trends now, you're seeing people, even within senior housing, not have to necessarily go to higher levels of care, because care can come to you. But even more than that, you have situations now where you can be in an apartment, single family home, and so on, where care and services can come to you. And you're seeing that shift with health systems. You're seeing a number of venture capital backed startups that are providing some of that. You're seeing a bigger role of artificial intelligence, machine learning, wearables. I have a Oura ring on me right now, which helps you with sleeping. It's interesting with Apple, when we look back at Apple and Steve Jobs, their impact on our lives, which is perhaps more ubiquitous than we would care to acknowledge. It may be that the Apple Watch is one of the crowning achievements as this health device to help us, get a heads up in terms of perhaps, heart conditions and so on. So it is another example, Frank, on this is, I think you're going to see increasing instances of just home sharing, where people
That's
have
a
an
great
extra
point.
bedroom.
I was just thinking that because I'm of the age that people know I'm in the industry, and they're like thinking, all right, what are we going to do? We're going to be, I have an up and down house. I don't know if I want to keep that. Should I go get a one-story place, or should I maybe we get together with a bunch of friends and get a place? And if we need caregiving, we bring somebody in to share. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, yeah. I mean, people that in some ways, that's an example of co-living. My book has a chapter on these new models and emerging ones and what that might mean.
Right.
But it also might mean you're a solo ager. You don't necessarily have a partner or spouse, and you may not have kids in the area. You might have an extra bedroom or two. And so you could even have roommates come in there, where provides extra income, some social connection. So I think you're going to see a lot of different models as this evolves, because people are going to have more service delivery with healthcare is changing, and then technology will enable things. So I think that's going to put pressure on senior housing today, because there'll just be more options. Now, that said, one piece that's really important, I talk about this in the book as well, is that and we're seeing this real time. Those that are in the industry can appreciate this, but even those that are looking at options for themselves or loved ones can see this too. We are in a real labor crisis right now.
Yeah.
And it's likely to continue because of the generations having fewer kids, because of some of our immigration policy, and then people living longer. So you might want to perhaps stay in a single family home, but you may have a hard time just getting reliable and affordable access to care. And so that's another element to be thinking about this. But it's gonna get, I think, crazy in a good way, Frank, because I think you'll see more options out there. You'll see new housing models emerge as part of it. So people have more options. And then My hope with my book and some of the content at Smart Living 360 is to help people just make better decisions around this. And one thing to mention before your next question, that is, um, about 90% of people, they when asked by AARP and some other outlets, when they say, "Would you prefer to age in place?" About 90% of people say that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny when you say that. I've seen those studies, AARP and others. Like, but what are you spending the money for to even do those studies? What do you think people are going to say? Of course, over 90% of the people want to stay at home. Now, the question is, what's aging in place? To me, there's a perception out there that aging in place means your home, but your home may be in a senior living community. That's your home, and you could age in place. So there, I think there's a little, my opinion, there's a little misconception there. And, I think they should stop spending money on these studies because it's a no-brainer. Of course, people want to stay home, but what's home? Where are you going to be safest?
Well, and that's a big question, Frank, because I think when they've done the studies, the ones that I've seen, but they frame it in such a way that it's around your current home. And so typically that definition means age for most people, aging in place in my single family house in the suburbs. That's typically what that
Right. If that's how it's defined,
Yeah, and that's
but
typically
but if you ask the question, do you want to age in place? Of course you do. If you want to live the rest of your life in your current home, that's a different, that's a different question.
and it's a really important question because I think what happens sometimes is that I have a chapter specifically devoted to beating up the term aging in place,
Yeah.
as well as a strategy, because that term, it's aging seems like it's something that's happening to you. You don't really have agency in it. It's just happening. And then in place means you're like a statue, which is precisely the opposite of the research around healthy aging and
Yeah.
longevity. It's
Right.
about being active, having purpose, leading these chapters. So there's a whole issue with the term itself. But I think as a strategy, one of the issues it often has is that it can lead to social isolation
Which is a big problem today.
it's a big, huge problem. And so I talk a bit about, in terms of the framework, when I think about place, or when I see place as literally one of the biggest decisions. Where you live is being one of the most important decisions of your life at every key stage of your life. And you made a point earlier about home. Well, home has a physical element, but also has an emotional and psychological, dimension as well. It's a deep topic.
Yeah.
Did a blog on it just last week on this, on what that means. And I think we're at a spot where the challenge and opportunity that each of us faces, whether regardless of our age, is how do we make sure that we're in the right place for the stage in life that we're in. And that might mean your single family house in the suburbs, but it might mean an apartment, might mean senior living. And one of the opportunities for senior living providers is how can they not just create a place, but how can they create home?
Yeah.
And how can they also identify the people for their communities that would really thrive there?
Yeah.
And having lived in a community, as I said, in my 20s, I got to see how it was an amazing spot. I was living in Atlanta at the time, independent living community. But I got to see, for the people, the residents that were there, many of them, it was awesome. It really was the perfect place for them at that stage of life. So there is, I think, a public perception right now that senior housing, in some cases rightly, but in most cases, I think wrongly, suffers from coming out of the pandemic, because I think a lot of people associate any type of senior housing with skilled nursing.
Yeah.
And of course, what happened there in the pandemic was so awful, a number of instances that no one would want to be in some of the environments the way it played out. But I've seen it firsthand how the right fit, right, well-managed senior housing community can be an amazing right place for people at a certain
Yeah.
stage of life.
And I think that, it's such a broad area, like you said. I mean, you got that person who's, they're tired of taking care of the house and mowing the lawn and maybe want to be in a senior community and they're very independent, all the way to people who, maybe have some form of dementia, need to be in memory care or nursing or whatever the case may be. So it's really a broad spectrum.
It is.
But But I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick 30-second break here. All right. Just to recognize our sponsor. When we come back, I certainly want to learn more about your book and how people can get it. And then I want to address the perception of nursing homes when we come back. So we'll talk about that. All right. So do you know anybody who may be concerned about an older driver? Well, Senior Care Authority's Beyond Driving with Dignity program is a facilitated self-assessment program for older drivers. This program has been designed to serve as a vital tool to facilitate older drivers and their families as they make appropriate decisions regarding the future of one's safe driving career. If the individual is a safe driver, an advisor will provide him or her with strategies on how to remain a safe driver as they progress through the aging process. If driving retirement is the appropriate decision, then the individual and their family are offered possible alternatives, resources, and a specific plan to ensure a smooth and successful transition from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. So to learn more, you could go to www.beyonddrivingwithdignity.com or call 877-907-8841 to connect with a Senior Care Authority advisor in your area. We're back with Ryan Frederick, who is the author of Right Place, Right Time, the ultimate guide to choosing a home for the second half of life. So Ryan, so before we get into some additional questions, I'd love for you to share with our listeners a little bit more about your book, who's your target audience, how can they get it, and anything else you'd like to share.
Yeah, absolutely, Frank. I am really passionate about the fact that where you live has such a key driver for your I'm describing as healthy longevity, because it's not just how long you live, it's how healthy are you, and do you have the financial resources to support your life at that point. It's really lifespan intersecting with health span and wealth span. And so place where we decide to live is foundational, I believe, for that. So my book, Right Place, Right Time, provides a framework for how to think about this. The Gallup Healthways Index, they look at healthy longevity in 5 different areas. They look at it in terms of purpose. Do you have a purpose that's greater than you that you can point to? They look at it in terms of social connection. Do you have a network of friends and family and so on that provide support and encouragement for you? They look in terms of physical well-being. Are you active in the way you can be? Do you eat a certain way and sleep, et cetera? And then financial well-being. Are you set up for a life that, increasingly is getting longer and longer? They say that 50% of kids born today here in the US will live to at least 100. So this idea of a 100-year life is no longer a fantasy, it's fantasy land. And then 5th, they talk about place, community. So how I see it is when you choose a particular home, and when I mean by home, it's not just your 4 walls, it's what neighborhood are you part of? Are you in an urban, rural, suburban setting? What metropolitan area? What region of the country? What state? Even what country for that matter? All of that together, that composite is a function of your place and home. And so I see is when you're in the right place, it nudges you to greater purpose. It helps you with social connection, helps you be more physically active and financially. And then the reverse is if you're in a place where perhaps you have little in common with the people around you, you're more socially isolated, the physical design of your house doesn't fit your physical needs and emotional needs, like then you've got headwinds around this. And so I believe strongly that if we can be intentional about where we live at each chapter in our life, it can go a long way to making sure that we thrive in each of these different chapters. And so there's in the book, I have an assessment there that allows people to kind of measure their current place based on the 5 metrics I just talked about. Based on the strong feedback from the book, I've recently put it on the Smart Living 360 website. So I encourage people, it takes just a couple minutes to go online and real quickly get a sense of, well, am I in the right place today? And part of the methodology as you play it out is, well, I may not be in the right place, but in some cases I can change my place. I can make some physical modifications. I can be more proactive to invite friends over, get to know neighbors that have moved in. Like there's some malleability of our place. Or in other cases, it may mean that a move is necessary. And that move could be within your neighborhood, version of aging in place, like we talked about earlier, Frank, or it may mean that you need to move to a different area. Maybe you have family elsewhere you want to reconnect with. And so this topic of going back to your question about target audience, it was written for empty nesters, in some cases pre-empty nesters, pre-retirees, retirees, out to put an age spectrum on it, really 50 plus. And it has a dualism, because I found readers that find it valuable for themselves, but also valuable for family members.
Great.
Um,
And they could go to your website at smartliving360.com to get
yeah, go to smartliving360.com and you'll see links to the book. You'll see that's where the free assessment is there, and there's also additional content with blogs and so on that allow people some of the key ideas for their thinking. That's the best place to go. Yes.
Yeah. So you talked earlier about the greatest generation of the world, and that generation, when they moved out of their home to go into some sort of senior living, it was nursing. It was. I mean, assisted living or licensed assisted living in the United States didn't start till the 90s. All right. So there's still, I think a perception, but I want to get your opinion is, people that don't want to move because they feel if they move, they're going into nursing, if they're going to make that move. And as you know, there are so many other options out there. I mean, you go into some of these senior living communities and assisted living, you walk in, you go, whoa, I'd live here. This looks pretty nice, So what do you think that perception is still there today?
Absolutely. And I would come at this at a few different angles, Frank. I would say the first issue we have here is around ageism. And the reason why that's relevant is because our society generally tells us that, particularly when we hit midlife and beyond, that tomorrow is going to be worse than today. Now, the irony in this, one of the most popular blogs on the Smart Living 360 website is one called the Little Understood Happiness Curve. And there's a happiness curve that's been documented now for well over a decade, which shows that there's a certain level of happiness in your 20s, and then it goes through a somewhat precipitous decline, so that in your late 40s and 50s, I like to think it has something to do with teenagers in the house, you kind of hit this bottom, and then you climb afterwards. It's actually a global phenomenon, but certainly true in the U.S. And so that in your 60s and 70s, particularly your really 70s and beyond, your self-reported well-being, your happiness is higher than it's ever been. And there's a bunch of theories behind it. Part of it is you've realized at that point in life what really matters, and you're kind of out of the rat race and so on. But there is, and I'm not trying to be naive about this, there are definitely, challenges, complexities as we get older. But there's a narrative here that is a really positive one. And so what ends up happening sometimes, because that's not well understood, because in our culture, it's seen as being less important as you age, we tend to not put as much thought sometimes around some of these decisions that matter, because, I may not be around that long anyway. It doesn't really matter, but it does matter. That's a key thesis that I'm describing. And so what ends up happening along the way is you got this ageism, and then you see within the housing environment, because I have this negative bias sometimes, my head does go to skilled nursing. And skilled nursing, that particular branch of this broader senior housing industry, has changed a lot, and it's continuing to change. In fact, as you know, Frank, the number of skilled nursing beds has been contracting. It's been getting smaller for years. And you're seeing more and more providers now exiting the business coming out of the pandemic, because it's so costly to run, because of the regulations. And therefore you're finding more non-institutional environments where people can provide care. I know of a number of groups, actually some clients of mine on the senior housing side, where they've exited skilled nursing, but they provide skilled nursing like care, but in assisted living. So
Yeah, well, it's becoming, even from the time I've been in the business, it was pretty much black and white, what you could do in skilled nursing and the type of care you could provide in assisted living. And obviously it varies state to state, but because of state regulations, but it's more gray. There's so much more that you could do in assisted living that would normally have been done only in a skilled nursing facility.
Well, and what's really yes, absolutely. And what's happening too is there's meaningful changes with these health systems now. So you're finding a number of health systems are using skilled nursing that's close to them as effectively very short, more complicated healthcare procedures. So without going into too much detail, the way skilled nursing has evolved, you've had short-term rehab and then long-term care. It started out initially going back to the 60s, where it was really just about long-term care.
Right.
And it has evolved. So now it has these two different pieces, but there's a lot of pressure on that business model today. So you're seeing a number of senior housing providers, as I described, kind of exit skilled nursing and provide long-term care capability in non-institutional settings. The implication, a couple implications. One implication for consumers is more so than ever, you got to do your homework.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where am I on this? And that homework's complicated. And if you're an adult child, it's overwhelming. I know, being one, and still, in fact, being a part of the business too. But you got to get smart, and you got to get smart. And that's part of the reason why I wrote the book is you got to get smart on the generalities of this. But then you have to be smart in your locale. What really are the options, here, either where my loved one lives or near me, if there's a move involved, if you don't live in the same location. But there's another implication for people too. Those boomers today, people in your 60s and 70s, 50s even, I highly encourage you to plan. What do you want these chapters to look like? Because when it becomes like an urgent matter, your degrees of freedom, your choices available are a lot smaller than if you don't have a broader plan. And then for the professionals in industry that are listening to this, it has big implications too, because you got to make sure that the company you're part of, if you're a CEO or an executive director, do you have what's your vision to thrive as this evolves? Because you're going to get more and more pressure, I believe, on the skilled nursing side. You have these labor issues are going to be issues for a long term. How can you really create a compelling value proposition for your existing residents, new residents, where people can really thrive? And one piece we haven't talked about too is it's really expensive.
Yeah.
So what can you do to find ways to make the price point more accessible for more people?
And if I could, add one thing, if you agree with me on this, I think you do, don't try to do it alone. There's professionals out there, I'm not trying to plug the organization that I'm with, but there's a lot of different professionals out there that could help you, but don't try to do it alone, because, it probably is the first time you're ever going to be dealing with this. So to know all the ins and outs and options, it's very difficult. So
I couldn't agree more, Frank. I mean, this is, when I talk to people about it, I frame it in the terms of what is the cost? What's the opportunity cost of making the wrong decision?
Yeah, no, absolutely right.
And it's a significant one. And I recognize not everyone has resources to necessarily hire third-party advisors and so on. But I do believe, for those in your audience that have a financial advisor, for example, if you've got some help to manage your money for a longer life, just don't only think about your finances.
Yeah.
Like what's, and in fact, one of the things that I envision that's come out of the book came out last year, and just the response to the book, I believe that people that have, for example, a financial plan for a long life, they should also have a place plan. what's my place plan? How do I make sure that I'm in the right place? What can I do to make sure that I can modify my existing place if necessary? What are my other options? Because you want to really make sure that you're set up for this long-term success. And that means it's very difficult to do it alone.
Yeah.
Who are advisors and content you get to help in that journey?
Well, I could talk to you all day about this stuff, but unfortunately we're going to have to go. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. There's a lot of important stuff in this topic, Frank.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining us. Check out his website, smartliving360.com. Be safe. Talk to everybody real soon.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.